Chapter 14. Preparing to Die. Reyes slowly opened his eyes from what had been a dream of sleep. He was still feeling very drowsy as he tried to lift his head off of the icy cold dirt floor on which he had just spent the night. He was shivering a little with the cold. Something was different. Clearly this wasn't the same cell in which he had fallen asleep. It was just far too dissimilar. It was smaller for one thing, and it also seemed lighter, better furnished, and felt more like a room than a cell. A quick estimate told Reyes that there were only about half of the inmates of the larger cell in the room with him. He tried to take in his surroundings, looking at the world with blurry, tired eyes. Most of those sharing this new cell with him were still on the floor, and it was hard for him to see exactly who was in here with him. Reyes counted 3 other harpies, including Quinagoff, but notably not Tanegi. There was no sign of the minotaur. Reyes also estimated that the room contained 12, maybe 13 elves, and between 6 and 8 goblins. Reyes blinked a couple of times and tried to focus on the room. It was certainly a lot brighter than that old dark cell had been. The dull grey blocks that had lined the other cell had been replaced by comparatively cheerful yellow bricks. It was natural light that was flooding into the room through a long and narrow window. The window gave the inmates of the cell a clear view of the main arena floor, the yellow sand, and the congealed blood of those who had fought and died in the arena since the sand had last been changed. It was snowing again, and this time the snow was making a concerted effort to settle and to cover everything in a thin white sheet. Seeing as there was no glass in the window, it was no wonder that it was so cold in the cell. Reyes tried to run through the events of the previous day in his mind. He remembered dinner arriving. It had been brought by the same 3 elves that had brought lunch. At least Reyes assumed they were the same 3. They had been dressed in the same way, and the 2 archers had taken posts under the oil lanterns in much the same way as those who had brought them lunch. Reyes also remembered that it had been a lovely spread, and the smell of all that lovely juicy meat had threatened to weaken his resolve. In the end, though, he just couldn't bring himself to risk elven food, and decided to stay hungry. Reyes' stomach grumbled with hunger to remind him that he had purposely gone without. If it wasn't the food that had put him to sleep, what had it been? Reyes vaguely remembered that having gathered all the harpies in the cell in a group, they had been discussing their plans for the battle, how they planned to work together regardless of which side they found themselves on. The majority of that conversation felt like it was a little more than a blur though, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up on the cold floor of this new cell. Reyes climbed slowly and stiffly to his feet. He felt a little unsteady, and his left leg hurt as if something had hit it, or maybe he had fallen on it. He assumed the elves had sent him to sleep. He placed his hands on either side of the leg and poured a little healing energy into it. The leg seemed to tingle for a moment, and then the dull pain went away. Although his leg might be fine now, the rest of his body felt like it was out of balance in some way. When he tried to stretch in the hope that it might help, he found that although his arms and legs were only too keen to follow instructions, his wings refused to move. For a moment he began to fear that his body had reverted to the time when he had first discovered the truth about his race. It had taken him quite a few days before he could really feel his wings, let alone use them. A quick glance over his shoulder told Reyes what was wrong. Sometime during the night, while Reyes and the others he was sharing a cell with had been fast asleep, someone had entered the cell and fitted his wings with a set of wing irons. From the look of it, the metal was old and rusty, and had at one time been splashed with something that had dried to an ugly reddish brown colour, belying the fate of one of the previous owners. The wing irons held his wings together tightly, and even pulled them a little out of shape, making Reyes feel more than a little uncomfortable. What else might the elves have done while he was asleep? Reyes began to inspect the rest of his body. His claws were still working fine. He sheathed and unsheathed them a couple of times to make sure. It was also good to see that the hammerstone was still firmly attached to his finger. He was sure he was going to need that soon. He was also feeling puzzled as to why the elves hadn't confiscated it. It was obviously a powerful ring. It was almost as if someone at the arena wanted him to keep it. One thing Reyes did find as he checked himself over was a piece of orange cloth tied to his left upper arm. So that was it, a small piece of cloth given to him totally by chance. A piece of cloth that defined who he was, what side he was on, and who he was supposed to kill. "It looks like we're on the orange team, my chief." It was Quinagoff who spoke. Like Reyes, she had been trying to get her bearings. She had obviously recognised Reyes and had come over to join him. "So it seems," Reyes replied. Tanegi? She's not here, my chief, Quinnigoff replied. She must be with the others. Don't worry, I know her. Tanegi will die rather than allow any harm to come to you. She would commit suicide rather than be forced to fight you, my chief. Hopefully it won't come to that. Reyes indicated Quinnigoff turned round so that her back was to him. Quinnigoff seemed a little uncertain of the request. It was hard to talk to someone when you had your back to them, but she complied. Now Reyes was able to get a better look at the wing irons that were holding Quinnigoff's wings together. There were 5 individual loops connected by a series of short chains about a centre point. There was no give in the chains. They had been pulled tight to allow Quinnigoff's wings no mobility at all. It almost seemed as if whoever had fitted these chains must have had a sadistic streak about them. Each of the loops was held closed by its own lock. If, in the heat of battle, one loop should be cut free, the harpy still wouldn't be able to take to the air. Removing the chains was child's play. They were designed to be worn by a harpy, and since harpies didn't normally use magic, there was nothing in the way of any protection to stop anyone from using an unlock spell to remove them. Admittedly, it took 5 spells, but the chains fell harmlessly to the ground. There you go, Reyes said. He looked towards the next nearest harpy in the cell and called to her. Who's next? As Reyes was getting to work on unlocking the wing irons from a second harpy, one of the elves in the cell seemed to be putting himself forward as the group's unelected leader. Okay, everyone, listen up. Fairly soon this door will open. He pointed to a small, unpainted wooden door. It looked like an interior door rather than one that would lead out to the arena, and we will be sent into the arena to fight for our lives. Reyes tried to ignore the elf. He was too busy to pay a lot of attention, but he could hear comments from all around the cell, mainly the goblins urging the speaker to get to the point. We stand a better chance of survival if we all work together. We need to stick together. If we fight as one, we can better defend against their initial assault, and then it will simply become a matter of mopping up the last few survivors. Who died and made you leader? Someone shouted. I expect you harpies to do your bit, the elf commented. I used to be in the army, so I have a little bit of military training. I can lead you to victory. I'd rather be led to freedom. The shout came from one of the harpies, the one Reyes hadn't gotten to yet. He removed the last of the chains from his current patient. The harpy looked around at Reyes. There was a look in her eyes that spoke volumes of gratitude. Then she stretched out her wings to their fullest, testing their newfound freedom. That feels so good. Reyes looked worriedly at the harpy's outstretched wings. It was bad enough removing the chains in this cell among so many other prisoners. At least few of them seemed to be paying any attention to the harpies. But it was hard to ignore someone who unfurled her wings in such a relatively tight space, and nearly knocked a couple of people down in the act. Now I need your sister, Reyes commented, indicating the one remaining harpy in the cell. Send her over, would you? She's not my sister, the harpy decried. We are all sisters today, Reyes replied. Please, do as I ask. It looks as if the enemy will have a minotaur on their side. Minotaurs are very powerful, stronger even than harpies. We can overpower him, but by doing so we might severely weaken our forces. Our best chance of victory will be if our harpies concentrate on attacking him and keeping their harpies busy, the elf was saying. As the harpy whose chains Reyes had just removed began to head towards the one Reyes had referred to as her sister, Quinnigoff asked him a very pointed question. You can't reach your own wing irons, can you, my chief? How are you going to remove them? Reyes grinned, restraining himself from laughing. That bit is too easy. He hesitated for a moment. The act of a harpy unfurling her wings had attracted a lot more attention from those inside the cell than Reyes would have liked, but no one had come running in from outside the cell with the intention of putting those chains back on. So, Quinnigoff said worriedly, what are you going to do, my chief? Reyes shrugged. A moment later, he was no longer a harpy. He was standing before his bodyguard as a naked human. He stayed that way for only a second, just long enough for the chains that bound his wings together to have nothing to latch onto. Then he changed back again. The chains fell uselessly to the ground. Wow, was all Quinnigoff could bring herself to say. Easy, Reyes commented. Like I said, you really are Lammerwort. It was the harpy whose chains Reyes still had to remove who commented. It seemed that she too had been party to the transformation. A short time after Reyes had removed the wing irons from the fourth harpy, the small wooden door was opened, and a pair of elves, wearing the same kind of worthless thin armour as those who had brought them lunch and dinner the previous day, entered the room. The two elves were armed only with short swords, which they kept firmly sheathed at their sides. 2 jailers in a cell with more than 20 prisoners, and they didn't seem at all worried that they might be attacked. Here in the arena there was nowhere to go except through the small wooden door. The door led through to a kind of antechamber. Here there was a large oaken door that clearly had to lead to the outside and into the arena itself. It was reinforced with heavy metal riveted straps. It looked strong enough to withstand several attacks from a heavy battering ram. Also in the room was a large table on which were resting a wide array of weapons and a small selection of armour. By the look of it, the armour was a one-size-fits-all strap-on kind of armour, simple and ornate rather than practical, where the one size was elven. Towards the back of the antechamber was a small podium on which was standing another elf in the same kind of armour as the first two. As the inmates entered this antechamber, he was making flapping motions with his hands as he attempted to quiet everyone down. "Right," the elf said, his voice almost effeminate. When he was happy that the volume of background noise had dropped low enough, he said, "In a few short minutes we will hear the sound of a trumpet. That will be the signal for me to open this door and let you into the arena. There you will fight, and some of you, maybe all of you, will die. The rules are simple. Anyone wearing a blue armband is your enemy. Kill them or they will surely kill you." The elf waited again as the ambient volume in the room had increased. It seemed a lot of inmates either hadn't come to terms with the truth of their situation before now, or maybe they knew the score already and were getting bored of being told things they already knew. "What about my brother?" one of the elves shouted suddenly. "He was caught with me, but he's not amongst us." "Then he must be with the others," the elven official replied. "But he's my brother," the prisoner cried. "Then hope that one of your friends kills your brother, so that you don't have to," the official commented. Then he rounded on the rest of the inmates. "You'll find weapons and armour on the table in front of you. There is plenty for everyone, so take what you need. Take only what you need. You will be disarmed if and when you return to your cell." Those who were nearest the weapon-covered table began to make their selections. Reyes tried to get closer to the table. He wanted to take a sword at the very least, and maybe a shield if he could find one. "I know what some of you are thinking," the elf was saying. "With so many others on my side, why don't I just hang towards the back and let others do all the work? Well, that is up to you, but here is a small incentive for everyone to join in. We have people in the audience who will watch each and every one of you. Every kill you make today will count as a victory towards your eventual target of 20 and freedom. Thus, if you kill 6 towards the enemy, you will be credited with 6 victories and will only need another 12, 14, someone shouted tiredly. It was one of the armoured elves who had opened the door leading to this chamber. The 2 elves were standing at the back of the crowd and seemed to be guarding the door. "That's what I said, 14 more to be eligible for release. You are up against more than 20 opponents today, so it's quite possible one of you could be free tomorrow. I'll admit it has never happened before. The closest anyone has ever got was 14, but there is always a first time. For those of you who do decide to stay at the back, or who are just unlucky to gain any kills, you will still be credited with a single win, assuming they survive." This again was from one of the guards. "Well, of course, assuming they survive," the official commented irritably. There was a short pause, and then the official continued with, "One more thing. I am supposed to tell you to go forth and slaughter your enemies. However, I have made a small wager on the blue team, so don't let me down. Go forth and get slaughtered." "I don't understand a word," Quinnigoff commented, her head firmly tilted to the side. "What is she saying, my chief?" "It's just a pep talk," Reyes replied. "Come on, let's grab some weapons." "Oh," Quinnigoff said. "I won't thank you, my chief. I think my claws will be fine." "As you wish," Reyes replied. He wasn't surprised. The only melee weapon most harpies seemed to learn how to use was her claws. Even the spears that Tanegi and Quinnigoff carried on duty were more for show than for anything. Conversely, Reyes hated using his claws. Whenever he tried to use them in the past, he always seemed to be in pain shortly after. On the other hand, Reyes did have some skill with swords. While it was true that there was hopefully a sword still in his ring, he would rather not call on that unless he had to. It was best to keep the abilities of his ring as secret as possible. Besides, why should he risk damage to his own sword when there was a wide variety of elven blades available for use? "You're taking a sword?" one of the elven prisoners asked as Reyes took what the elves would define as a long blade from the table. "I like swords," Reyes replied simply. He also reached for a small round shield. It was an arena shield, small but sturdy. The shield he hoped he still had in his ring was bigger and more than likely stronger, but in order to access that he had to put on the entire suit of armour. That would make his wings unusable. This shield might be small and relatively flimsy, but hopefully it would help deflect any arrows that might come his way. Never heard of a harpy using a sword before, the prisoner commented. I hope you aren't going to let us down. I have my own plans, thanks, Reyes countered. Then someone shouted, You, harpy. At first, Reyes automatically assumed that someone was trying to address him. The authoritarian tone of the voice suggested it was either the official or one of the guards, probably the official. Reyes turned his attention towards the elf on the podium. The elf's comment wasn't aimed at Reyes. One of the two harpies, whose names Reyes still didn't know, was hovering over by the door, and the official had seen her. The official stepped down from his podium and approached the harpy, trying to act as threatening as an elf could when confronted by a stronger opponent. What happened to your wing irons? The harpy perceived the elf as nothing more than a threat. She turned and lashed out almost without thinking. Her aim was good. Her claws ripped open the elf's throat. The elf clutched his throat in horror. He fell to his knees, his eyes pleading for help. Then he toppled forward onto the dirt floor and continued to writhe for a moment as he tried to breathe. In the meantime, the two guards standing over by the door unsheathed their weapons and then retreated back into the cell where Reyes had first woken, slamming the door closed behind them. Great, one of the goblins intoned. What are they going to do now? Even if we ring, they'll kill us for this. I plan to tell them the harpies did it, one of the elves replied. Look, Reyes offered, that's a flimsy door. If we get that open and deal with the two guards beyond, then we might be able to buy enough time to escape. Are you still going on about your escape plan? The elf accused. Suddenly, the sound of a trumpet echoed through the entire arena. What do we do? What do we do? One of the goblins started to panic. We step out into the arena, Reyes told them all. I don't think we have any choice. Thanks to you and your ilk, an elf commented. Reyes thought for a moment that the elf was about to attack him with his newly acquired blade, but he seemed to have second thoughts. We never did have a chance, then the elf commented. He walked over towards the heavy oak door and pulled it open. We can attribute blame when we come back. If we come back.